Welcome to the USC Race and Equity Center and the USC Rossier Pullias Center for Higher Education's joint webinar on supporting equity on campus in today's contentious political environment. As you all know, higher education is experiencing unprecedented challenges and attacks. As educators and researchers, many of us have voiced the need to do something. Both the Race and Equity Center and Pullias are thrilled to offer this session to provide you with language, tools, and strategies to help take action. It is my pleasure to welcome our speakers for today's session, Adrianna Kezar and Esmerelda Hernandez-Hamed. Adrianna Kezar is the director of the Pullias Center for Higher Education. She's an expert on change leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion, faculty, STEM reform, collaboration, and governance in higher education. Esmerelda Hernandez-Hamed is the interim director of the Colleges and Universities Portfolio at the USC Race and Equity Center. Her expertise focuses on DEI recruitment, hiring and retention, and higher education and equity-minded teaching. And I am Jessica DeCuir-Gunby, the Robert A. Naslund Chair in Curriculum and Teaching and Professor of Educational Psychology at the USC's Rossier School of Education. And I am the Executive Director of the USC Race and Equity Center. Before we begin, I want to talk to you briefly about our session format and our agenda for today. We will begin with an icebreaker. Then Adrianna will provide a discussion of shared equity leadership, followed by a short Q&A session. Then Esmeralda will discuss the equity playbook, followed by another short Q&A. Then we will open up for a general conversation with you, followed by a few brief announcements. While our speakers are talking, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A section. If you don't see the Q&A section, just post them in the chat, and I will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat. And so at this time, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Adrianna for our first segment.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And it is such a pleasure to be here with you all. We know that it's such challenging times right now, and you're all, I'm sure, looking for advice and ideas about how to support equity on campus. But we thought the first thing we'd love to do is if you could put in the chat what brought you here today, because we really want to know about some of the specific challenges that you all are facing. So please feel free to add those to the chat, and Jessica and Esmeralda and I will be looking at that so that as we focus our comments over the next hour, we make sure to address some of the important things that brought you here. So please continue. I see some things coming in here like political climate and keeping morale high and loss of funds. And so I really appreciate everyone putting in some of the specific things we can address. I see Nina Conroy has her hand raised. Nina, is it possible for you to put your comment either in the Q&A? Oh, it's going to Q&A. Great. Thank you for that. And we're going to have several points in our conversation where we're going to stop and engage some of your questions. So please feel free to put those, as Jessica said, in the chat. So I'm going to start off by briefly talking about shared equity leadership. And one of the reasons that I'm going to talk about that is because what we are finding on campuses is that this model, which embeds equity, diversity, and inclusion work across educators in all sorts of different roles on campuses, is a strategy for navigating today's environment because there is not a particular area, set of roles to target. So that's one of the reasons that we're talking about this model is it's proven that it works very well in today's environment. It was not created for that purpose. And I want to tell you a little bit about the background of this model and also what we're learning about how it works in restrictive state environments. I'm going to give you a very brief overview because of our limited time today. On the Pullias website, you can find all of our research reports that I've got here on the slide, as well as various webinars that dig into detail about the shared equity leadership model. It came out of a study that we started in 2019 with the American Council on Education. They had just finished a major study looking at national data over 30 years, comparing how we were performing with students that historically have not done well in higher education. So this is racially minoritized students, first generation, low income students, and the progress was not what they had hoped for after many years of dedicated work by colleges and universities, and they wanted to understand this issue better. One of the things that I told them is that some of this data did not surprise me, given that most of the programming has been on the side of campuses. We have mostly not redesigned our our overall educational structures, curriculum, approach to student success. We have created programs that I call it like to fix the students rather than redesigning our campuses. And so with this deficit kind of approach, I had always worried whether we were going to make the kind of progress that's needed. And when we really see transformation, it's because we create culture change, and culture change happens when different educators have a different set of values they bring to their day-to-day practices, and they then change the structures around them to support a different environment. But I said, but this is an empirical question. Why don't we study campuses that have actually made progress on getting rid of their equity gaps for their students and creating environments where students thrive? So let's look at a set of those campuses and find out what they're doing. So that study began in 2019. And what I imagined, since we picked 8 very different kinds of campuses, we looked at community colleges, research universities, technical colleges, liberal arts colleges, and I thought that there would probably be very different paths to the ways that they were able to support and create this stronger environment where students from all backgrounds were able to succeed. But instead, what we found was something very similar called shared equity leadership. And that's what I want to briefly share with you. But we've continued to do research on the model. And as you can see here, then have developed out a variety of reports in detailing how they did particular kinds of work, like how they shifted and changed their accountability structures, how they rethought different roles on campus, how they build capacity amongst a much larger group of educators if they're responsible for doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So one of the things that we found that was happening on these campuses is they had a critical mass, a large number of individuals who were involved. So staff, faculty, administrators, sometimes even students or community members that were helping to rethink the environment and lead the direction around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This was not surprising to me, actually, because I have been studying transformational change on college campuses for 30 years. And one of the things that have always come up in this work when I see transformation, whether it's improved teaching and learning or adoption of assessment or implementing new technologies, I've always found that when you see sort of widespread adoption, one of the things that I have also seen was a broad ownership and shared leadership for the change that was being proposed. One of the other things that had emerged in my research on shared leadership is that you get better decision making when you have these individuals who represent different perspectives on campus. So a faculty or staff member might better understand the challenges that students are facing, but somebody in administration has access to certain levers to make changes. So working together, they could produce much better results. Not only do you have then the better decision making, the better agenda setting, but you have so many different groups working together, they break down silos on campus to student success. So they're working to create a more unified or community-based sense of support for students that doesn't exist when we have just individuals here and there who are taking on responsibility for equity and inclusion, but not working together. And then what we were also finding early in this work is that it made the work very sort of difficult again to target, because even before the recent Trump administration, we had states that were enacting restrictive environments, and we saw how this approach was already working several years ago in those environments. The model itself has three major component parts that I'm going to break down in detail for you. But it starts with personal journey work that educators across campus commit to doing to develop personally their own understanding of systemic inequalities. And also the organization has a commitment to supporting that work. Second was a set of values that different leaders across campus began to both espouse and enact. And third, a set of 5 practices that they worked on collectively. And so not everybody is doing every practice or value. As you'll see, it's different people leaning into their own strengths for these different aspects. So the first personal journey work, as I mentioned, is we found so often when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it's those who've experienced systemic inequality that tend to engage in this work. Here, there were various entry points where individuals all committed to doing this personal journey work. And the organization then had all these kinds of opportunities for people to engage in that personal journey work. So they spoke from things like one-to-one mentoring and individual professional development, but down to things like group professional development, learning communities and book clubs, or whole unit-led retreats and forums where they were able to do this kind of professional journey work, personal journey work, and even into annual evaluations, so formalized in that way. The second thing that they talked about that helped create this new culture, this new environment, is a set of values that people showed up differently. So it's not just about doing things differently, it's about being different on campus, having a kind of leadership that transforms the environment. So I'm just going to bring up 2 of the values given the time we have. One is comfort with being uncomfortable. This was, they said, very hard for academics because it represented not jumping to solutions, but sitting sometimes with uncomfortable feelings that come up when, for example, a student might express that they experienced a particular trauma based on an interaction with an educator on campus or a particular policy or practice, and just sitting with and understanding how that made the student feel deeply, really actively listening, so that it's, again, important to get to solutions, but without really understanding the damage done, the kinds of solutions that are developed are not going to be as systemic and meaningful. So they said this value of having comfort with being uncomfortable is particularly important in coming up with the right kinds of solutions down the line. The second was vulnerability. This was leaders who expressed that when they had made mistakes, so it was okay for others to make mistakes in terms of their own either knowledge about diversity, equity, and inclusion, their own sort of practice, how they, often in the administrator saying how they didn't realize something they had done in terms of being like created a kind of power dynamic that made others feel like they couldn't speak. So kind of speaking to the fact that they had made those mistakes in the past made it possible for others to rethink their own practices. The third kind of main component are these set of practices. The foundational one being understanding and centering the needs of systemically marginalized groups. So again, coming back to that sort of listening and priority setting around these groups. The practices then were relational practices in terms of cultivating positive relationships, building trust, and welcoming disagreements, was a way that leaders both modeled this and tried to foster these kinds of spaces, different relational practices, so that It's going to be really difficult for our students to feel like they're in a place of safety and love and care without having positive relationships between groups. And we often have our own divisions between, say, faculty affairs and student affairs, and like sort of histories of distrust. So like we need to first work on ourselves before we can create positive environments. Another important practice is challenging the status quo. They create an environment where the hierarchies were diminished, and questioning and disrupting policies and practices on campus became normative and expected, if you will, so that that we're really looking at trying to redesign our systems. I can't go over all the practices, but I just want to mention that the personal journey work you could see was part of these developmental practices. There's really an intentional focus on helping others learn and learning along the ways. And then, of course, as you imagine, structural practices like hiring more diverse leaders or creating rewards and incentives for the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I have to go over this quickly because I want to get also into how we've seen this modified in restrictive state environments. But what we found is that in the end, this model works to advance a kind of culture change where students can thrive, because it's both working with individual change, but also organizational change simultaneously. And too often we're working, with just one or the other. We tend to do like a lot of individual, professional development around diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campuses, but without changing the environments themselves, or we change the environments without helping support individuals change. It also has the kind of structures and accountability built into it. As I said, there's a whole report on creating new accountability structures when you make this the responsibility of many more people. And as you heard me mention, it really addresses the sort of relational environment by creating, through living these different values, creating very different relationships and trust on a campus. And that's what supports how it all fits together and works. What we've been doing is working with campuses. Most recently, I'm starting up shared equity leadership, and we have in particular chosen those who are in restrictive state environments. And now, of course, we're all in a federal environment that makes this work very difficult. We knew shared equity leadership already worked well in these environments, but we wanted to sort of test out the model. Were there any things really specifically that it helped address? And what are some things that might need to be modified as we get into this more difficult political environment? So we have this report, at that QR code that you can take a look at, that was just recently released, that shows the results of this work. And what we essentially found is, again, the model is still holding up in the federal and state environments where DEI is. I'm going to go back to QR code. I see some people would like to look at that. So we're seeing, oh, thank you. The download of the report, Esmerelda just put it in the chat. So the model is working really well within these environments, with a few modifications that I'd like to talk you through. So the first is that in terms of personal journey work, they're finding that this is more important than ever. It's something that, again, you can't target every single individual at a college or university. So the fact that people are doing this individual work continues to be important. They noted that in some environments, they're not using the words critical consciousness. So we talk about a personal journey towards critical consciousness of systemic inequalities and our systems of power. So they said, talking though more about people's need for personal journeys work in more generally still works. And what they've also found is they can do different. They can certainly continue the organizational work of mentoring, where they're finding maybe some difficulty, so they can model and mentor and coach. Some campuses cannot have as much formal programming around this, but sometimes they're still integrating it into, say, like a larger sort of book club discussion, and they may have to rethink its use in annual evaluations of employees. So just Mostly it's supporting the work and continuing to help people evolve their commitment and continue to do this work. Values were really less challenging. Nobody is looking at or exploring individuals' values on campus. So the ways that people are showing up, the ways that they can help build these strong relational environments through the ways that they act differently in terms of like care for their their other educators in their setting, or the ways that they lean into courage or innovation. None of those values are being challenged. And in fact, they said they were really using a lot of these values like creativity, innovation, and courage to help them in the face of the restrictions. And so there's several examples in the report about how you can utilize those three values to help in rethinking the environment to respond to the restrictive legislations. The one area they said in terms of values that's been tricky is transparency, because being open about some of the work you're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion can open you up to challenges. So that was one where they're trying to figure out how to do the best in terms of continuing to be transparent and have conversation around these issues. The biggest area we saw where they needed to rethink practices was among the structural practices, needing to think about the hiring diverse colleagues. How can they do that successfully? Accountability for and data collection around these issues, depending on their state environments. They had to maybe rethink how visible they want to be in terms of accountability for this work. So the structural practices we found were the ones where they had the most concern, but they said the relational practices is actually something they can lean into more deeply, expand their network at this time. The developmental practices just need some minor retweaking around thinking about having separate DEI professional development and instead threading it into other kinds of professional development. And they're really leaning into communication practices. So one of the ones that they were using to help people in moving along in their understanding, because there is pushback on some of the language, some of them are strategically changing their language. Many of you, I'm sure, are thinking about terms like belonging or community engagement or inclusive excellence. So they're rethinking their language and are finding language that works well within their institution. So for the most part, with some moderate tweaking, the practices are holding up. They talk, though, that one of the things that's really important in today's environment is to really lean into collaborative networks. Whether this is connecting with other campuses in your state that are facing the same environment, whether it's connecting to local community and businesses about getting advice from them about what is language that'll resonate at this time period, or just building stronger connections with community to be supportive of the kind of work they're trying to do to support students, and saying they're getting a lot of support from their communities, or leaning into larger national organizations. So they talked about how collaborative networks, both internally, locally, across the state and nation, were really important. And so one of the reasons we're so glad you're here today is it's availing yourself of resources that are just pivotal at this point in time to help to navigate those challenges. So we're going to just have just a very brief pause for any burning questions, and go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, that was great, Adrianna. So I know that y'all have a lot of good questions, so keep on thinking about the questions. Even if you don't have it right now, we can kind of save it to the end and have that discussion later. But we do have a couple questions in the chat. So someone's Bethany mentioned, I am curious what convinced the colleges to support the personal journey work. In my experience, there is an expectation that people do this on their own or is ignored as an important part of the promise.
That is a fantastic question. And I think what we found is this critical mass that comes together, usually at the beginning, 'cause we're working with campuses starting this up. It's maybe a group of 20 or 25 faculty, staff, and administrators who have that commitment to supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion on their campuses. And they found each other, and one of the things that they recognized is how important it is to develop personal commitment. So that's the reason, and that I really, if personal journey work is a challenge on your campus, I really suggest you read our capacity building report, because it leans really hard on how campuses provide the support for personal journey work and the rationale behind it. I think it'll be a really helpful resource. Because that's really where we distilled from these groups, how they were able to get broader support for personal journey work. But it comes from their own understanding that they couldn't do the work authentically until they themselves have been doing some of this personal journey work, and everyone's still evolving, right? You never complete the journey. There's always new kind of understandings. We weren't talking about trans students 10 years ago. There's always evolutions in our thinking around systemic inequality. And so part of this is helping people to understand that, helping people to understand we all need to be on that personal journey. And they were able to, through this mentoring and coaching and modeling, to help expand into a much larger group that needed to be doing that work.
And one kind of quick question, comment. Someone wants to know, can you please provide the resources are linked on the Pullias site where we can find more information about your model that you discussed today, or just resources in general for the Pullias Center? So that would be great.
Absolutely. I'll throw that into the link. I think Esmeralda had put in a few, but I will make sure that the general link to the site is there.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks,
All
Jess.
right.
All right. And so we provide a continuation of this conversation, and we are so honored and happy to be partnering on this webinar with Pullias and the incredible work that Adrianna and her team have been doing on the shared equity leadership model, because we have built a tool that we believe complements the shared equity leadership model by giving more strategies for the important relationship building, for the communication, for that breaking of the status quo. That is such an important part of that model. And most higher education practitioners care deeply about their students and peers. And so when we mostly inadvertently, right, reproduce inequities, particularly racial ethnic inequities, we at the Race and Equity Center see that as partly a problem of practitioner training and practice, right? And how we lead are products of socialization and preparation, and we often have not been socialized or prepared for having conversations about equity in the best of times, much less in times where these topics are particularly contentious. And across disciplinary fields, right, research finds that being able to visualize and imagine different scenarios can help us to problem solve in real scenarios. So, for example, if drivers who imagine, what would I do if a driver cut me off right now, are better defensive drivers, right? People who pre-prepare topics of conversation and imagine how a conversation might go are better conversationalists, etc. And so we believe that with new ways of thinking about leading, that everyone is capable of supporting equity and racial equity in particular. And so we created this playbook, which is meant to do just that, to provide strategies with some examples to help you build a set of plays, right? That when a new and difficult situation having to do with equity arises, that you have a playbook in your mind that you can more easily access and apply to new situations. And so we're going to be doing just a quick overview of what is in this playbook, and later, early the next month, we'll be providing a longer free session for folks who really want to get their hands in and practice with us using this playbook. You can find the playbook at this using this QR code. I'm also placing the link in the chat as well. And as part of this playbook, there are basically three parts, the anatomy of the playbook. We have our strategies, which are listed in the front, but also in relation to the second part, which is the scenarios. So we provide some different scenarios that might be particularly relevant to today and how these strategies might play out in those scenarios. And then related to that, we provide some reflection questions as well that you can use to think about your situations, the situations that you're in, and reflect on what information do I need to make a better leader in this scenario. And so we provide a scenario like the one that I am presenting here. So think about a scenario in which we're with colleagues. There is a department that is having a discussion. I know some folks have brought up hiring already in the chat. And so we might have a Dean Williams, who says who has brought everyone together and is saying we need to remember our strategic plan goal of diversifying faculty and staff representation as we decide our department's hiring priorities. And we might have a faculty member, Dr. Harmon, who notes we've already made progress in bringing in diverse faculty. It's time we got back to focusing on merit. We need to comply with the federal administration's guidelines to secure our funding. In response to that, the room falls into an awkward silence, with some faculty members nodding in agreement, while others shift in their seats. A few junior faculty members, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, look visibly uncomfortable but do not speak up. Dean Williams interrupts the silence, saying, "There will be a lot of things we'll need to consider as we hire. Let's look now at our current list of hiring needs." And so I pose the question to you: why might silence occur during critical equity conversations? And go ahead and put some answers in the chat. Silence might occur because people are processing, because of power dynamics, fear, the hierarchy in the room. Oh, goodness, we're really coming in. Lack of safety. They don't want to be accused of anything in either direction, don't want to offend, right? Fear of stigmatization. People are thinking about what to say or not to say. Absolutely. This is what research is finding as well. So when silence occurs, it might be using silence as a form of protection, or resistance, right? In any way. It could be a denial that systems of oppression exist. Like and people noted that you can be silent because you're afraid of kind of your position on either side of an issue. Silence might occur because people are afraid of silencing others or being silenced if they speak up. The desire to maintain a safe space in which people do not feel uncomfortable, right? And so this might be happening at a lot of your institutions right now, where we are within this contentious environment, we might have folks who are not having conversations at all because we don't want to be put in these uncomfortable situations, and how much that keeps us from being able to lead, build those relationships, be able to do this work, even if it's not in a loud way where publicly we are doing this work. We know that we still need to do this work within our institutions, right? And so again, this playbook is meant to give us some strategies so that we are still able to have productive, actionable conversations that build our capacity within our teams and our institutions to have conversations and still make equitable decisions and changes to our practices and structures and policies. So what we have provided in the playbook are some scenarios, and I believe there are at least 4 scenarios on 2 different topics that provide an example of how a strategy might be used. And we ask, like, what language or facilitation strategies are used to engage practitioners? What do the facilitation strategies produce, right? And so we can think about that right now. If we're thinking about the last meeting that you had with your team, your department, your area, your office, what were there facilitation strategies that were used by those who were leading those meetings? Maybe that might have been you, maybe that might have been someone else, right? That engaged everyone in the room to be able to have these conversations productively. And so I'm really quickly, because of time, going to go through some of the strategies in the book and in the playbook, and these also apply, to the shared equity leadership model. So again, I love the way that we've complemented the two. We've provided some common narratives right now that seek to undermine particularly racial equity work, and we need to be aware of these to make sure that we know how to dismantle them. Being able to publicly garner multiple voices when equity implication conversations arise. So how do we create a space where there are multiple voices coming into the conversation, where folks are more comfortable or expected and know that they have a safe space to say something, both that might be unpopular for whatever reason, and that brings to bear all of the evidence and ideas and the origin of these ideas that are going to be coming up within these conversations. Strategy 4, equity-minded campus leaders employ facilitation strategies that extend beyond keeping the peace, right, to actively guide group participation and facilitate the unpacking of disagreements. And so we do need to move beyond, right, staying silent and not having these conversations if we are to continue this work within this context. Strategy 6 is one that is very aligned with the shared equity leadership model. Again, equity-minded campus leaders build relationships and trusts one-on-one with colleagues and supervisees. It's the same thing that we would say of teachers within the classrooms. When you have a relationship one-on-one with your students or your peers or your supervisees, you are better able to have more productive conversations around difficult issues like racial equity. Equity-minded campus leaders end with action steps like creating space for gathering evidence and a return time for sharing and further discussion, right? Think about how to get folks involved with the process. And that helps as well when we are thinking about how to diffuse responsibility for racial equity. If we're giving people action items at the end of meetings, then everyone knows that they have a role and responsibility to play in making sure that we are moving our work forward, that we are committed to our values, that we are still doing the work that we know needs to be done for student learning, knowledge production within our campuses. And so, we provide in the playbook some ways that folks can go about this, right? And so just, thinking about the difference when folks might start a meeting by saying, I can't assume that continuing to support our missions and values mean the same for everyone in this room. So this will be a chance for us to dialogue about our goals and how we will get there, and how that completely changes how, what that communicates, what beyond these words that communicates that we are open to different views, and we are going to talk deeply about what that means for the work going forward, and how that sets us up to have better conversations about equity and racial equity in particular. We also provide, an example of what it might look like to meet with participants one-on-one. And in this particular scenario, which is our third scenario in the playbook, we have these two offices that are now merging because DEI is no longer an office, and the deans from these offices are checking in with each member of their respective teams, and they encourage, during those one-on-ones, they encourage collaborative behaviors and kindly but firmly correct individual actions that have left colleagues feeling unsupported or unheard. And we provide kind of these one-liners that are able to help you, again, build your tool set so that when you're in those information in those situations, you can realize like, oh, I have a question here that might be really helpful, right? This is what I noticed, so next time try to do this. I understand you feel that way, but I think I've seen research and facts that don't support this claim. Could you do some evidence gathering and look at these additional resources? Let's come back together to talk more about this, right? You've made an excellent observation. Next time, would you share this to help everyone make the same connection, right? Thinking about your role as a leader in making sure that we are that we are building this connection and this shared responsibility. All right, and I've already seen people kind of put some different strategies that you all are using in the chat. Please do so. Like if there are, this is certainly not an exhaustive list. There are many helpful plays that help us to support racial equity conversation in contentious environments, and I would love to see that. But with that, looking at time, let's have a question.
There are a lot of questions in the chat, in the Q&A in general. I do have a question. So, and this might actually kind of, I don't know, it might take us into the larger Q&A. So, Adrianna, feel free to kind of jump in too. I know we're talking a lot about these equity-minded strategies and things that we can do and what our leaders can do. I think the assumption is that our leaders are equity-minded. I think there are a lot of places that we have leaders in place that are not necessarily equity-minded or willing to engage in these really great strategies. So what do we do, or what do people do when they're in situations where their leaders may not necessarily be equity minded? are willing to engage in some of these strategies that that you are suggesting?
So I've got two thoughts, and then Esmeralda, feel free to drop in. First is what we found on some campuses, especially, we just had a webinar on what do you do with leadership turnover? Because senior leaders are turning over rapidly in higher education. So how do you keep then a new person who comes on board, even if you had a leader who was on board? So there's this constant need to kind of help. Well, so we were talking about how do you manage up? So how do people in the middle manage up, provide the information and evidence about the work that you're doing, how it's supporting student success, connecting them with resources like the Pullias Center and like the Race Center, so that people can see why this work is so important. So they talked about their work to manage up, and for those of you interested in that, we have some resources about that on the Pullias website. The other is I'm finding that it's those people in the middle of the organization who are really able to carry this work best for the shared equity leadership because of the turnover at the top and because of the insecurity of many faculty and staff in terms of we have so many contingent faculty members on campuses. So it's kind of this middle group of leaders, like, the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning and somebody in institutional research and some staff member in student affairs or department chairs, like that. This middle management is really carrying the work on campuses these days because of the turnover. And if they network together, Jessica, they can really create then, just as getting to know your other colleagues who are working there in the middle, you can build a really solid coalition that supports this work, even in the face of not having a lot of senior leadership support. That's always, you don't necessarily have to have them being the champion for this, but you don't want them to be resistant. They need to at least be allowing the middle to lead.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. We do see in places where this work is most effective that these middle managers that have access to executive leadership, but also have folks that are within their area of the college and institution that they can lead using these strategies, right? Although I would say that anyone at any level of the institution can also do these strategies. And Adrianna, I know you're familiar with tempered radicals, right? The idea that even even a classified staff, when they aren't able to be in a position where they have this larger coalition, they start really small with one-on-one peer relationships, right? And so that this is certainly more effective when these relationships and connections are wider spread throughout the institution, but that you need to tap into whatever size network you have at this moment. And right now that might be just one or two other people, or it could be a number of offices, right? So being able to use these strategies at whatever level that you can.
Absolutely agree. Nicely said.
Great. We do have a couple of questions. Let's see. There are a couple of people asking questions when you mentioned about changing names, about people that necessarily like the critical consciousness. And so, like, could you talk more about the whole idea of, should we be changing changing names? I know that's kind of a controversial issue right now about, particularly those of us who are in the equity space and then wanting to support doing this work. And product and names are important. How we name things, what we call things are important. But also, people who don't like this work are also attacking the work based upon the names and what we call it. And so could you talk a little bit about, so I know, Adrianna, you specifically mentioned critical consciousness, for instance, and maybe using personal journey as the framework. But so what do we do in terms of just we're just we're focusing on names. So what do we need to do about the names?
So as we've been working with not only the campuses that are engaged in starting up shared equity leadership, but as I've gone around to conferences all over the country talking about these issues, people are saying, we're doubling down into committing to do the work. The terms have always been evolving. We were equal opportunity, we were multiculturalism, we were diversity, just separately. Then we were equity, now we're diversity, equity, inclusion, but the terms have always been evolving. So they said, given that it is ever evolving, we're not, whether we should be tied to these particular set of words seemed like they were not, they were willing to, they didn't, what they were most worried about is that colleagues would feel like they were abandoning. So they needed to talk about how they're not abandoning the work, they're shifting the terms to be strategic. And then they help them to understand this history of how the words have shifted. And that doesn't mean we've not given up these values over the last 30 or 40 years, even as we've changed terminology and refined our understanding. So that's how I'm hearing people leaning into the language issue, but understanding that tension that they don't want their colleagues to feel like they're abandoning this work. So it's about how do you acknowledge that the work is still being done.
Yes, I love that. And also acknowledging that we're in a tough position and that we are being forced to do this. This is it hits me right here, and Jessica, as we work at the USC Race and Equity Center, this has touched us very deeply, and so I think it is, as Adrianna said, just an honest conversation of why we are changing the language. What are the plans for when the pendulum swings back? How are we thinking about the work still in real ways? And then also assessing where you are in the agency that you have. And so, for example, I totally understand at institutions, especially institutions in states where you know where there are policies that are clearer about restricting language, where restrict the language to be able to continue to do the work. Me at the Race and Equity Center, I will help you to do that, but I myself will not be restricting my language until someone tells me that I have to. And that's been from a critical assessment of where we sit in the institution and within higher education. And so I know that there are people that are still out there that are looking to hear someone still say the term racial equity. And I want to be here for the people that still need to hear those terms, even at the same time that they aren't able to use them. And so just, having that critical conversation about what do we need to do. And if I'm in some situation where I have to change my language, I will. But that will be after a critical assessment of what is my agency, why do I have to do this, what's going to be the what is this going to do for the work or against the work.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I think a lot of times we assume that the only option we have is to totally change and modify what we do. But I think we do have agency to kind of, to keep our language and do what we do. I've seen in chat, it is a First Amendment right. And then, we do have academic freedom. So I think that's important, which leads me to a question that I really do want to ask that's in the chat. Someone said, "Wow, I'm glad you included a playbook example with a doomsday type scenario in which here in California, a DEI department program is forced to merge with some generalized department. But don't we have the option to refuse? I know this isn't a workshop on activism, but where do we draw the line?" And somebody expanded, saying, "How can we actually grow our units and expand our DEI vision impact work on campus?" Suggesting that other departments move into our area instead of our offices being absorbed into some kind of generic area.
Uh, I can start with that one. I'm yes. And I think it is like everything, gathering your evidence and your, like like keeping your receipts, right? So for example, for the California community colleges, there's still so much language in the ed code, in for California, in their missions, that you can use to continue and expand the work, right? It is still like equity is literally like in the ed code, right? And so for, for folks who have that, and they still have that leadership support at the chancellor's office, continue to expand for as long as you can, right? Because again, once you have to, once you have to kind of curtail work, when the pendulum swings back, the amount of work that you've been able to do before someone tells you you absolutely can't is going to help you to bounce back later. And that's going to be so important for our institutions, our students, right? And it's going to get you through whatever years of anti-DEI we are going through. So that's what I would say. Like, write your receipts, find your receipts, and use them.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, I believe in doing the work that you do and don't overcorrect and, push back until you absolutely have to, right? I mean, you have the right to refuse. Is that, can you merge with this other unit? No. I mean, did they ask? You say no. And of course, I do understand the politics of universities, and so you may not have an option. But I mean, you have to do the work, and so at some point, your voice is going to be asked and needed, and so use your voice. We don't always have to be passive. We're going to be very active in this process. Um, and help shape actually what happens to your unit in the university. So it's we're at time, and so we do have a couple really quick things, and so we just want to at least let you know some upcoming rec and Race and Equity Center and Pullias events, and so if you can definitely click on the QR codes and see what's going on. And we definitely want to stay in touch with you in terms of at Pullias and the Race and Equity Center. And please follow us on Instagram, and then and Pullias has a wonderful YouTube channel. So please make sure you stay connected with us. And also the Race and Equity Center, we have an interest form, and so if you can click on the QR code and scan a QR code, you can see some of our wonderful events that we have going on. So we really want to make sure we stay in touch with y'all with Pullias and at Race and Equity Center. We have a lot of wonderful activities and a lot of wonderful sessions, and we would love to have you more involved with us in all of our activities. Thank you so very much. You've been a wonderful audience. We really appreciate you joining us and coming here, and because we need everyone here in this fight, because it's going to be a long haul. And so thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica, for leading us through, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you, Adrianna and Esmeralda. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.